Gazprom, Sinopec, China Investment Corporation. We're seeing an emerging German, Russian axis. By the way, there's been a lot of criticism of the post-Cold War unipolar world and a desire to see a more multilateral world. I think we see that particularly in this administration. The problem is the alternative to unipolarism is not multilateralism. The alternative is unilateralism. In other words, once you no longer have a boss, it's every man for himself, or every woman for herself. The point being, countries are all going their own way. They're not falling in line between a sort of a kumbaya, let's all sit around the table. They're just saying, let's cut a deal because the United States is no longer providing the kind of leadership we require. So these problems are, they're not residuals or artifacts, but it's a new and expanding phenomena. Neo-mercantilism is actually rational in a world of declining marginal returns due to complexity. In other words, if you're actually in a negative sum or zero-sum world, you should be really good at playing a zero-sum game. And the United States is still playing a positive-sum game, but that may not sync up with the reality of economic growth today. And I like to say victory in a negative-sum game is still a victory. So kind of where China is coming from. This neo-mercantilist state capitalist vector is independent of the sovereign debt crisis and the crisis of inflation that I just described. But I'm not trying to pile on, but maybe I am. I'm saying that we have multiple crises, multiple vectors that relate to each other that are converging. This would be a problem even if we were in a world of growth, even if we did not have the sovereign debt problems I described for a lot of reasons. But coming on top of the world I described, it reinforces this kind of negative-sum game mentality. So we talked about debt. We talked about mercantilism. There's kind of a lot of gloomy news. But I'm going to finish or work towards the end with a little bit of good news. The United States has a secret weapon. We have an extremely powerful financial secret weapon. We seem reluctant to acknowledge it, reluctant to use it. But the United States is a gold superpower. Now, if you think that, well, I'll explain it. It's a very good question. Thank you for asking that question. Let me explain exactly what I mean by that. But what I've done is, we're all very familiar with oil, right? So you look around the world. Some people have a lot of oil. Some people use a lot of oil. Some people have it and use it. Some people just need it, don't have it. There has to be transported. There are strategic choke points. We're all very familiar with thinking about the world in oil space in terms of production, use, reserves, and transportation. Think about the world in gold space for a minute. By the way, if you think that gold is not money, and if you think that gold has no role in global finance, you can get home early because I'm going to talk about it for the next 15 minutes. But historically, I think I've got 7,000 years of history on my side versus about 30 or 40 years on the other side, so I will talk about it. By the way, for those of you who remember Goldfinger, like a lot of younger people haven't seen it, you say, oh yeah, I remember that movie. You say, what was it about? I was like, well, Goldfinger was a bad guy, and he was going to steal all the gold in Fort Knox, and James Bond and Felix Leiter shut him down. Well, that's wrong on two counts. Remember, Goldfinger wasn't going to steal the gold. He knew he couldn't do it. He was going to blow it up with a nuclear device, so his gold would be more valuable. He was going to destroy the gold, not steal it. And he was not really the bad guy. He was a front man or an agent. Anybody remember who gave him the nuclear device and who was behind Goldfinger's plot? It was China. Funny how that plays out. So, so now this is, for those of you with children, or maybe when you were children, you remember one of the most popular features on Sesame Street is a little IQ test. Which of these is not like the other? And kids love this, it's one of their favorite things. And I've shown this in audiences of professors of economics from Ivy League and MIT and Chicago, Stanford, Hopkins, and other top schools. But I've also shown it to some of my really young nieces and nephews. And it's interesting, the professors look at this and they say, well, that's easy. The monopoly money is not like the others. The others two are stores of value. And the 5-year-olds look at it and they go, That's easy. The one over on your right is not like the other because the other two are piles of paper. And so the economic question of the day is who's smarter, a 5-year-old or a university professor? And I'll leave you with that. Okay, so what we're saying are these destruction of paper money. We've seen it before, by the way. The two times when the United States came closest to destroying its currency were both existential crises, the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And you remember the Revolutionary War, the expression, not worth a continental, our currency was debased and worthless. And in the Civil War, the greenback was a pejorative term. It was like, again, it was kind of debased, worthless currency. But in an existential crisis, you do what you have to do. Revolutionary War, United States of America, as defined in the Declaration of Independence, would have failed. And in the Civil War, potentially the United States of America's union would have failed. So these were existential. I have no problem with central banks printing all the money they want, because what are you going to do if that can't be worse than the country actually being destroyed? Better to destroy the paper currency. But both times we bounced back. Alexander Hamilton, by the way, it never would have occurred to Hamilton, Adams, it never would have occurred to any of them that you could actually have a paper money system. They understood money as silver and gold. And actually, silver played an interesting role in early American history. But to them, that was the only kind of money. And that if you had paper, it wasn't really intrinsically valuable. It was a warehouse receipt where you could go down and get some gold and silver if you wanted to. But that was just your option. It was more convenient to carry the paper. But it never occurred to them that it wouldn't be gold-backed. And after the Civil War, up through Reconstruction, President Grant put the U.S. back on a gold standard approximately where it was before the Civil War, which was highly deflationary. It was very difficult to do, but he insisted on it and was successful in that. But that period, from Reconstruction to World War I, 1876 to 1914, the United States was on a gold standard, $20.67 an ounce of gold, pure gold. That was one of the greatest periods of prosperity in American history. And by the way, it was deflationary, but it was good deflation. It was the kind of deflation that says, you know, 10 years ago, a computer was $5,000 and now it's $500. That's 90% deflation, but we think that's good, right? Why would you fight that? Why would you try to prevent that? Well, that's the kind of deflation we had in the late 19th century as a result of productivity, invention, and technology. So don't automatically equate deflation with bad outcomes. It can be a very positive thing depending on how it's done or what causes it. Now, 1922 to 1936, we did have the gold exchange standard. This was after World War I. The gold exchange standard was generally regarded as a failure, as a contributor to the Great Depression, and it's the #1 reason why gold is discredited today. Why? By the way, I'm not a gold bug. I haven't been sitting around my basement for 25 years counting gold coins. My background is in the bond market. I got to gold by studying the paper money system. I worked for a primary dealer. I dealt directly with the Federal Reserve. An expert in the U.S. government securities market. The way I got to gold was by understanding that the paper money system was no longer going to work. But having said that, when you get there, you get there. The gold exchange standard is the #1 reason why gold is not taken seriously by most economists today, why they say you can never go back to it. It was destructive. It contributed to the Great Depression. Well, the gold exchange standard did contribute to the Great Depression. I think that's a valid analysis, but not because of gold. It was because of the price. Winston Churchill had a nostalgic affection for the pre-World War I price of gold. He thought that it was, in effect, a renege or a default of the Bank of England. And by the way, Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, felt the same way, that you had to get back to that pre-World War I level. Well, they had printed so much money in World War I, there was no way to get back to that level without massive deflation of the bad kind. You've got to lower the price level a lot to make gold worth that amount of money after you've inflated the currency. You've got to make all that extra currency go away, which is highly deflationary. So it probably did contribute to the Great Depression. The solution would have been to be realistic about how much money you had created, how much paper money you had created. So you know what? The price of gold can never be $20 again. It ought to be $40 or $50. If you had pegged the price of gold at $50 in 1925, that would have been somewhat inflationary. We might actually have avoided the Great Depression, partly based on that, because you could have had a much larger paper money supply off the same amount of gold. So there was a failure of that gold exchange standard in the 20s and 30s, but not intrinsically because of gold, but because they set the price at the wrong level, which did cause deflation and did contribute. So it's a reason to think hard about the right way to go back on the gold standard when we get there. And then, of course, we had another period, 1944 to 1971, of the Bretton Woods gold standard. Again, 44 to 71, one of the longest, most sustained growth, most prosperous periods of American history. So I think it's interesting that two of the most prosperous periods, 1876 to 1914, 1944 to 1971, were both associated with the gold standard. We've had a lot of problems at times when we weren't on it. So let's just kind of, to answer your question, why are we a gold superpower? First of all, here's a global snapshot. The blue line is the growth of paper money, and the red line is the quantity of gold. So you can see what's going on there. We start to go up around 71 when Nixon took us off the gold standard for the last time. It really goes kind of hyperbolic, closer to 2000, and continues in that mode today. So when people say gold's a bubble, how high can gold go? My point is that's an irrelevant question. Ask yourself how low the dollar can go. That's a function of how many you print. This is kind of an indicator of the price of gold. Now, when you're on a gold standard, one of the big things you have to figure out is how much gold backing relative to paper do I need? Do I want 100%? A lot of people say that. I don't think that's necessary. Do I want 40%? In the 1950s and 60s, the United States operated on 40% backing. That was the law. We had to have equivalent of $40 worth of gold for every $100 of paper money in circulation. And if you're prepared to maintain the price, you don't need 100%. You just need enough to be a credible buyer and seller, so when people want to cash in their paper for gold, you've got enough gold, and after a while people go, well, okay, you're good for it. It seems like that's a stable price, and so they're comfortable walking around with the paper money because they believe they can get the gold. And 40% is probably enough to do that. But what these bands show is that the black line would be the theoretical price of gold if you had 100% backing. The red line is the theoretical price of gold if you had 40% backing, which in my view is probably enough. The gold line is the actual price of gold. And what you see today, that gap there, is if you were going to go back on a gold standard, in order to avoid the deflationary blunder of the 1920s, in order to avoid the mistake that Churchill and Montague Norman and others made by setting the price too low, you'd have to move the price of gold up to there, somewhere in there, so that you had the right ratio in order to be non-deflationary. And that number is somewhere between $3,000 and $7,000 an ounce. So when you hear people talk about those numbers, they're not just like crazy people who are talking a position or trying to throw mud at the wall to see what sticks. It's actually a rigorous analysis. If paper money collapses, this is where you have to get back to. Now, here's the good news. These are the amount of official gold holdings. The U.S. is by far the largest, 8,133 tons. It's not all in Fort Knox. About half's in Fort Knox. The other half's in West Point. Interesting, they're all military bases. Germany is a gold power. IMF, but a lot of the IMF gold is United States gold that we gave them for our quota. Italy, believe it or not, is a gold power, and so is France. After that, it drops off really quickly. China's a bit of a pygmy. They have $3 trillion worth of our paper, but they only have about 1,000 tons of gold, which is not worth that much, certainly relative to the U.S. By the way, there are no gold powers in there. This is the rest of the world, but there's nobody in that bar that's larger than Russia at 668. In fact, quite a few are smaller. Ireland has 5 tons of gold. Greece has 100 tons of gold. I've consistently ranked Greece ahead of Ireland, partly on that basis. But if these were warheads instead of metric tons, you'd kind of like our position. And this kind of goes to your point of why I'm saying that U.S. is the Saudi Arabia of gold. This is the same thing kind of in a pie chart. Assuming we're on friendly terms with Germany, Italy, France, and the IMF, when we, and Germany and the United States together, have a very decisive voice in the IMF, you can kind of sketch that out as a block, throw in Japan, they're our friends. So we probably control 2/3 of the world's gold in friendly terms. By the way, my thesis that the U.S. never went off the gold standard, we said that the dollar was no longer convertible into gold, but I believe we've been on a de facto gold standard ever since. Right now, the gold that the United States holds is worth about $350 billion at current market levels. The M1 money supply is about 1.6 trillion. You do the math, that's a 20% ratio. That's